Peak Human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
Peak 人間
Peak Human.
You guys are in for a treat. Dr. Frank Mitloehner is about to destroy every argument every anti-meat propaganda spewing know-it-all has ever let slip from their quinoa-loving lips. I'd list them all to get you fired up, but it would take too long. You're just going to have to listen up and pay attention to every second of this episode. Dr. Mitloehner has a master's in agricultural engineering and animal science from the University of Leipzig, Germany, and a PhD in animal science from Texas Tech University. He's currently a professor and air quality specialist at UC Davis and conducts research and outreach that is directly relevant to understanding and mitigating air emissions and greenhouse gases from livestock operations, as well as the implications of these emissions for the health and safety of farm workers and neighboring communities. He has served as chairman of a global United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, hosted partnership project to benchmark the environmental footprint of livestock production. This is big, everyone. He'll talk about how he helped correct the FAO data, which is the world leader in this kind of information. These are the bogus statistics used in the film Cowspiracy and that vegan activists still try to use today. He corrected the scientists and showed that the numbers were completely false. He's also published dozens of papers on the topics we'll be discussing today and travels the world giving lectures on this as well. All this talk about livestock is making me hungry. I'll have to drop a plug-in for my grass-fed meat company, Nose to Tail, which you can find at nosetotale.org. It's keeping this podcast alive and hopefully me as well. We have some amazing products like the Primal Light ground beef with liver, kidney, and heart mixed right in. It's so good. I've been eating a lot of it lately, and you don't even taste all those nutrient-dense bits and pieces. This is such a great way to get in your vitamins and minerals. It's basically the world's best multivitamin, a delicious patty of sustainably grown beef raised right here in Texas. We've got great boxes you can get delivered to your door, or you can also create your own. You gotta at least check this stuff out at nosetotale.org. I spent a lot of time creating the site myself, and I'm very proud of it. If great steak isn't your thing, then you can also support this show on Patreon at patreon.com/peakhuman, or click through the show notes. For a few dollars a month, you can keep this thing chugging along and also get the full extended show notes. These things are like a free college education, or better. Like this podcast, a lot of work has been put in them. You can also grab the It's What Else You Eat, Not the Meat t-shirts while getting a copy of the Food Lies film at Indiegogo.com. We still definitely need your support as we try to scrape enough money together to keep these editors fed. They're down for the cause. They're eating beef and skipping out on those worthless carbs and sugars. Trust me, they're living this stuff and making this film the best it can be. So keep me from taking on any outside sponsors and support these worthy causes and ventures. I really appreciate it, everyone. This wouldn't be possible without the generous support of the community. Thanks again, and here's Dr. Frank Mitloehner, my new favorite guy around. All right, well, Dr. Frank Mitloehner, thanks for coming on the podcast with me today.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Yeah, I've been wanting to talk to you for a while. There's so many myths out there with greenhouse gases and animal agriculture and water and methane and a million things. And you're probably the best guy to talk to because you're an active professor. You're at UC Davis studying all this stuff. So let's dive in here. Just tell us a little bit about what you do on a daily basis.
Yeah, so I'm a professor and air quality specialist. And so depending upon what time of year you ask me, I might be teaching or doing research, or I might be traveling and giving talks at places. I work with NGOs and with livestock people and with agency personnel. My life is very diverse that way.
That's great. Yeah, you're spreading this good information. It's hard because there's so many vegan propaganda, anti-meat agenda people giving us the opposite information. So you're out there studying the real science and giving us the correct information. So we can start with the top. A lot of people saw Cowspiracy, and they think that animal agriculture is worse than the whole transportation industry. Is that true?
Well, this is a notion that came about from a 2006 publication by the United Nations FAO. And the FAO, back in this Livestock's Long Shadow piece, said that livestock indeed produces more greenhouse gases than the entire global transportation system. Since then, they have corrected that, and I was probably one of the main reasons why, because I basically told them where it was wrong. They use different methodologies for livestock than they did for transportation. So there's no more talk about that, okay? And livestock is a totally different ballgame compared to transportation. Let's say in California alone, the place where I live, transportation is responsible for 50% of our greenhouse gases, and all of livestock combined for 5%. So that's just in California. In the United States, the numbers are different again. But, just to give you an idea, that Cowspiracy number and their comparison is way off.
Yeah, they were saying 18 or 20%.
Well, Cowspiracy actually said it's 51%, and that's absolutely laughable. Globally, livestock, and that's all livestock species combined, are responsible for 14.5%. So that's 14.5%. The original, and that number comes from the FAO in Rome, the Food and Agriculture Organization, who had previously estimated livestock emissions to be 18%. But again, they are now at 14.5%. But again, this is a global number. This is not a number suitable for the United States.
Yeah, so the United States what is it now? What is the official numbers now? 3.8%?
So if you go to the agency that's officially in charge of inventorying everything, all emissions in the United States, that's the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. When you go to the latest emission inventory, you'll find that all livestock combined is responsible for 3.9% of direct emissions in the United States. That's in contrast to around 28% for transportation US-wide, 28% for power production and use nationwide, and the same number for other industries. All fossil fuel consuming industries in the United States combined amount to approximately 80% of our greenhouse gases. That's 80%. Those industries consuming fossil fuels. And all of animal agriculture combined is 3.9%.
Yeah, exactly. I'm looking up these numbers and putting them in the Food Lies film to let people know how wrong the public perception of this is. And so I know the authors of the study publicly retracted this, that you called them out, that they used a different life cycle analysis. They used apples to oranges comparison. So just quickly, you could tell us about the life cycle analysis and what they did wrong and how we do life cycle analyses.
So an LCA, also referred to as life cycle assessment, is a way of looking at a product or at a service from cradle to grave. And that means, for example, if you want to know what the carbon footprint of a pound of beef is, then you're not just interested in the direct emissions from that animal, the belching of methane, let's say, or emissions from its manure, but you're also interested in everything that leads to the production of that meat, from soil emissions, to crop emission, to feed emissions, to the animals themselves, to their manure. But it doesn't end there, because sooner or later that product needs to leave the farm and go to a processing or distribution plant. It needs to go to a supermarket. It needs to go to a restaurant, or it needs to go to your kitchen. Eventually somebody eats it. The second somebody puts that product in their mouths, that's the grave point of that product. Cradle to grave means you assess all environmental footprints of that product or of that service from A through Z.
Mm-hmm.
So the FAO did that with Livestock's Long Shadow, with this infamous report that quantified the environmental footprint of livestock. And they did it well. But they didn't do the same thing. They didn't use the same methodology for transportation. For transportation, they didn't use a life cycle assessment looking at all impacts in producing cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships, roads, and harbors and airports, but they only looked at tailpipe emissions of these vehicles. So for livestock, they looked at everything in a life cycle way. For transportation, they only looked at tailpipe emissions. And that's an apples to oranges comparison.
Well, it's insane. I can't believe they did that. Did they ever apologize or say anything?
They did acknowledge that this is not a fair comparison, and then later they corrected it in a follow-up publication. And so, as far as I'm concerned, everything is settled, and not just that, they have moved forward from that point by establishing a global partnership called LEAP or LEAP. And this global partnership has since established one global methodology on how to do it right. It's the global gold standard for LCA. The FAO oversaw it, but in a partnership with national governments, with NGOs, and with the livestock and poultry and feed industry. And I was the first chairman of that LEAP partnership, this global program. So in my opinion, they saw that there was a mistake in it. They went back and corrected it, and they moved forward, establishing a way to develop global guidelines to circumvent these kind of problems in the future. But the horse had left the barn, and all of those people who have a beef with livestock, so to say, still like that old number and that old comparison and continue to use it even though they know it's erroneous. And that's a problem.
It's a huge problem. And yeah, I was just about to say that a lot of the people on the other side knowingly mislead people with numbers. And you can pull out all kinds of different numbers to say different things. And these people who are against meat consistently do that, right? With, say, for water, or you can give us some of these misleading figures.
Well, look, everybody, you, I, vegans, everybody has some kind of a filter, some kind of a bias, okay? So I would say that I continuously strive for not having a bias, but I do, of course, everybody does. So the people you are citing, they have more than an opinion on consumption of animal proteins. It's in many cases closer to a religion than a dietary preference that I detect. And the reason why I say that is because the need that these people have to convert others, meat eaters, to eat just like they do is almost missionary style, and or worse, where in reports and so on, they actually clearly outline that they want to take you and my choice of what we eat away from us. And that is a point that I am really critical of. They can eat whatever they want, just like they can pray for whoever they want, or love whoever they want, or vote for whoever they want. But to tell people in a country like this what they eat, what they should eat, and pretty much force their point by suggesting drastic increases in prices for animal-based foods and so on is, in my opinion, truly non-democratic and almost authoritarian style, and I can absolutely not live with that.
Absolutely. That's why we have to fight this. And I have to, people ask why I'm sometimes aggressive with my, trying to combat this information. And we need to do that. So what are some of these misleading numbers they use? Because people say, we'll just start with water. People say, it takes 100,000 gallons to get 1 ounce of meat or something.
Well, look, this is really getting ridiculous because you have to see that animal, let's say on pasture, most beef cattle, let's just talk about beef for a second. So a beef animal grows up on pasture, regardless of how this animal is finished, whether it's grass finished or corn finished, the animal will spend at least 2/3 of its life on pasture. So let's say a beef animal that is corn finished, let's say here in California, goes to the packing plant when they are 14, 15, 16 months of age. But the first 10 months or so, they were on pasture. The water associated with the meat that they produced during that time stems from a trough where they drank from, but the feed was irrigated by rain. It's so-called green water. To count that water that was needed to grow that grass that the animals ate in its footprint is ridiculous. This is like counting all the crops that are non-irrigated, but they are rain irrigated, and assign their water use through green water to the products. That's not sensical. I understand that people count blue water, and that's basically tap water. When people count that, I understand it. But I don't understand when they count green water, which is basically rain. Okay. Also, you have to understand that the water that goes into an animal is within the latest a day excreted. Okay. It's not staying in this animal. It's going in and it's coming out.
Yeah.
Okay. It's going in, it's coming out. And it's a cycle. It's very cyclic, just like it is with you and me. What we drink sooner or later comes out. And that's just the way it is. So it's not that it gets lost or something, but it comes out. And when it comes out, it hits some plant and serves as fertilizer, just like the manure does. In my opinion, it is a ridiculous exercise to count green water for animal-based commodities and their needs.
Yes, absolutely. Do you have some of the figures of a more accurate number in front of you, or?
I think that there is some very active research as to what is credible and what is not. And because it's not my immediate area, I cannot really tell you the exact numbers. But what I can tell you is numbers of water use for food production are always astronomical. And we have to ask ourselves, is producing food wasting water? if you ask me, well, it's such a fundamental thing of what we need, I really wouldn't call it that. For example, if you want to grow one almond nut, it takes a gallon of water. One walnut takes 2 gallons of water. That's a lot of water. That is a lot of water. If you compare, let's say, a gallon of almond juice, I don't call it almond milk because they don't lactate, but a gallon of almond juice with a gallon of dairy milk, then you will find that the almond juice has a lower carbon footprint, less greenhouse gases associated with producing it. In fact, 10 times less, okay? So one could say, hey, how about just moving into almond juice then instead of dairy milk? Well, there are other environmental footprints associated with these two products. For example, the almond versus the dairy milk. The almond juice has a 17 times higher water demand. 17 times higher than the dairy milk.
Wow.
So it has a lower carbon footprint, but it has a 17 times higher water footprint. If you were to look at what does it take to produce a bottle of wine, to produce one bottle of wine requires 700 liters of water. One bottle of wine,
Wow.
700 liters of water. So those people telling us, we should eat crops directly, we should eat fruits and vegetables instead of animal-based foods because we save one trophic level and that's more efficient. Okay, well, you can feel that way if that's your personal choice. But would you be following that throughout all your consumption choices? Would you say that you let go of drinking a glass or a bottle of wine because you can just as well quench your thirst with a liter of water?
Yeah.
I mean, if it were all about preserving and conserving natural resources, then we would not drink wine. We would not drink coffee. We would not drink tea. All of that is resource intensive, and it is more resource intensive than drinking water. But we still decide to drink tea and wine and coffee and beer and so on, because it is part of our lifestyle choices, as is the consumption of meat and eggs and dairy products and so on. So these people who feel they have to be missionaries about that should really be a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more critical of their entire food choices and see if they are real about this, okay, throughout life. And I predict to you that they are not.
Exactly. I mean, it's a lot of that, just like their, I don't know, virtue signaling, just them, I don't know, some of it is their moral superiority, or they think that they're so much better than us because they choose to not do this and they ignore other things. They are killing animals in other ways, but they're like, oh, well, I'm not purposely killing animals, so I'm better than you.
Yeah, in my opinion, this is just, it's just a joke. If you are growing row crops, the animals that go bye-bye by you doing this are in the millions. And that's just because, when you till a field and when you fertilize it and when you use pesticides and so on, then all different kinds of smaller animals, but, including rabbits and so on, but also gazillion insects go bye-bye. That's just the way it is. So our food choices will affect the lives of others. The question is a rabbit worth less than a pig or a chicken or a cow? And that's a value judgment.
Exactly. And we should also talk about the protein quality when we're talking about these comparisons. So it's crazy to compare an ounce of beef or an egg to a bean, correct?
Well, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. I mean, no nutritional in their right mind would say that a protein is a protein. For example, if you compare the protein in a glass of milk to the protein in a glass of almond juice, the protein in that dairy milk glass is twice as bioavailable to humans as the protein in the almond juice. The same is true for beef versus tofu. Same is true for real beef versus beef alternatives. So if you eat an Impossible burger versus a real burger, a beef burger, both of them might have the same amount of protein, but the protein from the Impossible burger is half as bioavailable to the human body as the beef that's real. So I don't understand why people in animal agriculture don't emphasize more the quality of the product they are producing. Because if you look at an egg, if you look at beef, if you look at dairy products and the biological value that these food items have with respect to having essential macro and micronutrients in ratios that are so well suited to what we as humans need, I don't understand why that's not a major topic out there. And it's, of course, another question as to whether or not people eat enough or too much. Balance is always a question, no matter what you do in life, right? We all know that. So obviously, when some politicians say, well, we shouldn't eat 3 burgers a day. Well, yeah, of course we shouldn't eat 3 burgers a day. And who does eat 3 burgers a day? That's ridiculous. We should also not drink 2 gallons of beer a day. I mean, come on. We all know that, right? So, but nobody in their right mind does that anyhow. So let's be real about these discussions.
Yeah. And even say with beans, I mean, how the protein doesn't have the same quality, and it also has an environmental footprint of how much water. And does anyone do these calculations, like a life cycle analysis that is actually apples to apples and shows the quality of the protein with how much it took to raise or develop?
No. I mean, people have compared, let's say, growing beans versus growing meat products and so on. And it is true that the plant-based proteins have a lower environmental footprint. There is no question about that. Okay, there's no question about that. But the nutritional value of a bean is always lower compared to that of animal-based proteins. There's no question about that. I mean, I've never heard anybody questioning that.
Yeah.
Okay, so the bioavailability of animal-based proteins is just, if it were 1, then that of a bean would be 0.5 or lower, depending upon what kind of plant-based proteins you count, with soy being the best on the plant side, and then it goes all the way down. Peas and so on have a very low bioavailability. So people just comparing protein to protein are really misleading the consumer by not describing what the biological value of those proteins are once we digest them.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to point that stuff out and getting a lot of heat on social media right now, actually. So what are some other numbers about cows and livestock? And I didn't know any of this before I started researching it. Like you said, 2/3 of their life is on pasture. How many cows are in pasture at once in the U.S.?
So in the United States, we have approximately 90 million beef cattle, 90. We also have about 9 million dairy cows. Just to give you an idea, some people say we have way too many dairy cows. Well, we have 9 million dairy cows. We have 9.5 million horses in this country. Obviously, the horses have nothing to do with our food supply chain. They're just there for fun. And the fact that we have 9 million dairy cows shows you how we have shrunk our dairy herd while still being able to satisfy the nutritional needs and the demand for dairy-based products. On the beef side, we have 90 million beef cattle, and the vast majority of them, about 75 million beef cattle, are on pasture at any given time. And 15 million are in feedlots. So people oftentimes, and you will hear your vegan friends say that a lot, they will say, well, all these beef cattle are in feedlots. That is not accurate. It's not accurate.
Not at all.
What is accurate is that the vast majority of beef cattle are finished in feedlots, but they spend there only 4 months of their lives. The rest of their life, they are on pasture. And what's interesting is that throughout the lifetime of the average beef animal in the United States, throughout their lifetime, they are consuming 85% non-human edible feed. So you also hear that oftentimes mentioned, that the critics of animal agriculture say, oh, we are feeding all of this human edible feed to livestock, and we shouldn't do so because that's a waste of these resources. But that is not accurate, because 85% of what we feed to livestock is non-human edible. And if you don't believe me, I don't mean you, I mean your listener, then go to a publication that's available online, Tackling Climate Change Through Livestock, which was published a few years back by the FAO in Rome, the Food and Agriculture Organization. And it has all the statistics that people might find interesting. For example, there are also those notions that cattle are inefficient. Cattle are not inefficient. Cattle make use of a resource that nobody else can. Let me explain. Most of the energy that we have in the world stems from the sun. When the sun radiates down its solar beams to the surface of the earth, about 1% of that solar energy is stored on earth. And what is storing that solar energy are plants. Particularly, it is cellulose in these plants. That is the most abundant biomass on Earth, cellulose. We as monogastric animals, we humans, cannot digest cellulose. Neither can pigs or chicken or so. But bacteria can digest that cellulose. And the bacteria that can digest the cellulose are in rich abundance inside the stomach of a ruminant animal. That's a cow, a steer, a sheep, a goat. They have in their so-called rumen, which is a very large stomach, in their rumen, they have gazillions of these microbes that can take cellulose and break it down into what's called volatile fatty acids. And then they make from those volatile fatty acids meat or milk or other products. So this is really important, okay? This is not some scientific discussion or so. This is a really important one. The vast majority of ruminant-produced food stems from the digestion of cellulose, and the cellulose is just out there in large quantities. Of all agricultural land in the world, two-thirds of all agricultural land in the world is what we call marginal land. And marginal land means that these two-thirds of all agricultural land in the world cannot be used to grow crops. Marginal land means the only thing you can do there is grow grass and legumes in order to sustain ruminant animals. They eat it and they upcycle it, and that's a really important notion here. They upcycle that cellulose that we cannot eat as humans into highly digestible and highly bioavailable proteins that are ideally suited for our nutrition. Only 1/3 of all agricultural land in the world, 1/3 of all agricultural land in the world is arable. And that means that land is suitable to grow crops. And that's where we grow all the crops for all people and all those animals that cannot digest cellulose. So ruminant animals are extremely important to satisfy the nutritional needs of humankind, particularly in the years to come when we will have way more people in the world than we do today.
Yeah, I mean, nature is miraculous. It's a perfect system that harnesses this energy that we can't use and makes it usable to us. And it's just so weird to me when vegans try to skip that process. It's like you just skipped the most important part of the process. It's really odd.
You know, I always feel that we should live and let live. Okay, I have a lot of respect for people who are vegans because they are making a food and dietary choice that's not an easy one at all. Okay, if you were a true vegan, you would really have to think about food in ways that a omnivore never does have to. Okay, because all day when they go to the supermarket, they have to think about, what went into this product. Can I use this? Can I not use this? Just think about it. A true vegan, a real vegan, does not just have to forgo pork and beef and dairy and eggs and so on, but a true vegan would also forgo all those foods that were produced with the help of pollinators, such as bees.
Yeah.
Now think about what that means. That means you can now no longer eat most nuts. You can no longer eat many of the fruits. I mean, this is really impacting your food choices if you decide that you forgo all animal-based foods. The number one domesticated animal in the United States today is not the cow or the steer or the pig or the chicken.
Mm-hmm.
The number one is the honeybee. Okay, all those bees that we have in all of those crops here in California where we grow a rich abundance of fruits and vegetables, all of those bees are domesticated. They're not free-living wild bees.
Yeah.
They are all domesticated bees.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to horses. So yeah, no one's talking about all these domesticated animals like the horses that are more than dairy cows, and they're, producing greenhouse gases or eating food or animals. I think you talked about that before too, is the pets that are eating a bunch of foods as well. So there's a lot of things that people don't talk about. And
Yeah, I mean, it is true. We have 9 million dairy cows. We have 9.5 million horses. Horses are not ruminants in contrast to dairy cows. They are hindgut fermenters. And while dairy cows really get rid of their methane through belching or burping, horses actually are hindgut fermenters, and that means they are actually getting rid of their methane through flatulence. But that is not the main environmental footprint they have. But the main environmental footprint is through their manure on the one hand. They are, of course, producing a lot of manure. And secondly, they're having quite some dietary needs being such a large animal, they're consuming a lot of alfalfa and other feed stuff, which in their production, of course, also require a lot of inputs, including energy inputs and carbon inputs and so on. Now, that's 9.5 million horses. In addition to that, we have 170 million dogs and cats, and they consume the equal amount of nutrients, and this is high value nutrients, compared to 70 million people. So 170 million dogs and cats eat the same amount of nutrition as 70 million people. Think about that for a second. And these horses, dogs, and cats are not what we eat, they are our buddies. Okay, the sole reason for us for having them is because we like them. We like to play with them. We like to enjoy them, but they have no contribution to our food supply chain. What I find interesting is that many people who critique animal agriculture for its carbon footprint, water footprint, other footprints, they will critique livestock, but they would never critique those companion animals. And you just have to ask yourself, why not, to arrive at the answer.
Yeah. So the numbers aren't what people say. It's not what you heard in the mainstream. But what about the treatment of animals and the efficiency? So I'm not necessarily for feedlots, but they actually seem like they're kind of okay. A lot of people characterize them as terrible, but there's a different way to look at them. And we're actually very efficient, and they actually seem like they're not that bad.
Well, I have to say, so I grew up in Germany. In Germany, and when I came to Texas and started studying for my PhD, I saw the first feedlot, and I was overwhelmed. I could not believe how large these things are. So the feedlots I saw had about 80,000 cattle, and that is a sizable number of animals in a concentrated area. They stay in the feedlot for about 4 months, and during that time they are fed feedstuff that is not grass or so, but by and large either corn or byproducts from, let's say, ethanol production, such as distillers' grains. So this is not a diet you would feed animals for the entire life, but you do feed them for about 4 months. I think it takes people a while to wrap their mind around what a feedlot is, how animals are treated, how they are fed, and so on. What I can tell you is each feedlot animal, each feedlot steer or heifer has about 130 to 150 square feet of space. And it's very rare that any feedlot has less space available than that. They all have a given amount of bunk space for feeding. They always have fresh water. They have fresh feed twice or 3 times a day. The feed is generally formulated by a PhD nutritionist, according to the specific needs of the animals in the stage of life. You have a so-called pen rider riding the feedlot pens every day. These are people who are trained in veterinary medicine who ride through those pens, and they look for animals. And if any animal has a sign of disease or injury, then these animals are taken out and brought to the feedlot hospital where they are treated. So it is not romanticized image that people have in mind when they think of a ranch or so. It definitely is not that. But it satisfies a need that the consumer has. And the need is that the consumers want to have a certain taste of meat. And that taste is something that you achieve when you finish animals in a feedlot. Let me tell you what I mean. And let me contrast a corn-finished animal that was finished in a feedlot to a grass-finished animal that's finished on grass. So a corn-finished steer will be on pasture for about 10, 11 months. And then this corn-finished animal will go into a feedlot for 4 months and then be slaughtered at around 14, 15, 16 months of age. The grass-finished peer will be on grass for its entire life. And that generally takes 26 to 30 months of age. So by putting animals in a feedlot for their last 4 months of age, you cut a lot of lifespan of their total life expectancy. And that, by the way, has a pretty drastic impact on the environmental footprint. Because if you shorten an animal's lives by half, then that means this animal now has consumed much less feed, it has had much less water to drink, it needed less land, and so on. So it's a long list. if you look at the whole life cycle environmental footprint of a corn-finished animal versus a grass-finished animal, and I know what I'm about to say is counterintuitive, then the corn-finished animal actually has a lower environmental footprint than its grass-finished peer.
Wow.
That's not to say that everything is great about it and so on. There are advantages and disadvantages of both, but it's certainly not as easy as to say, an animal in a feedlot is a bad choice. Or so the other reason why people do this, why they put animals in feedlots, is because it drastically impacts meat quality. By having an animal go to slaughter at 14 versus 28 or 20 or 30 months of age, is that this younger animal has much more tender meat. Okay, it's a much younger animal. It has a more tender meat quality. And if you look at the palm of your hand, you see those lines. And those lines, when you see those lines on a steak, are referred to as marbling. And when you look at the marbling of a corn-finished steak, that marbling is pretty much intramuscular fat. In the case of a feedlot finished steer, it's white and it has a very specific flavor. Whereas the marbling from a grass-finished animal will be more yellowish, and that comes from the keratin those animals ate on pasture. And the muscle fibers will be older, and therefore the meat will be tougher. The corn-finished steak versus the grass-finished steak taste differently. The meat is much more tender, and it has a different flavor because of the differences in fat quality. So there are reasons why we have feedlots. This is what the American palate demands.
Yeah, well, I'm really interested in this because I think there is a big place for it. And I don't even know where I stand on this because I actually have a grass-fed meat company kind of help distribute that to people. And I think it's fantastic. And there's reasons why people like it and I support it. But I think there's a place for the conventionally raised meat as well. And I eat that meat as well. And part of it is just a price point that people can afford, right? I mean, I'd rather have people, not everyone has a huge budget in this country, and I'd rather have them eating a good source of nutrition like beef than eating some cheap processed wheat and soy and grain and all this other stuff, right?
Well, I have to tell you, I love grass-finished beef, so I don't want you to take any of what I just said as me saying I don't like this process. I really love this process, okay? I think it is a beautiful thing that we have a natural process of converting sunlight into cellulose and then into a highly valuable animal-based protein, okay? To me, that's a beautiful process. And you cannot beat that with any kind of artificial process. And that includes the ultra-processed Impossible Burger or Beyond Meat or so, okay? So while I say that, while I enjoy the taste of grass-fed beef as well, I'm just describing that the majority of Americans, when giving the choice, would prefer the corn-finished taste. And that's just statistics, okay? That's just, and the market is satisfying that demand.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I just think, there's just room for both. And so I have this huge question about hormones and antibiotics. Does that actually, if they're used, does that actually get into the meat that you eat?
Okay. First of all, antibiotics don't go into the meat, period. They don't go into the meat because, and this is also true for milk, because if they are used, for example, to fight a disease, then there's a so-called withdrawal period. And this withdrawal period is, according to label claims, 50, 60 or so days. And that means by the time an animal is slaughtered, there are no traces of that antibiotic left. And the same is true for milk. If you treat a cow because she has mastitis or so with an antibiotic, then this cow will be taken out of the milk supply chain. She will not milk into the bulk tank. Every tank that is taken from a dairy to a creamery is checked for antibiotic residues. And if any residues remain, then the entire bulk tank will be rejected and sent back to the dairy. I can tell you nobody would risk having antibiotics in the product because the consequences would be immense. Coming to the other question, which is hormones. It is true that growth hormones are used in beef production. They also used to be used in dairy production, are largely now taken out of dairy. BST is hardly used or is not really used in the fluid milk supply anymore, even though it is a hormone that's also produced by the cows themselves, but it's not added to the cows at this point. On the beef side, beef animals in feedlots, for example, are supplied with what's called a growth implant. This is a small implant put into the ear. And after a while, this hormone, which is either estrogen or testosterone, these are the hormones that either females or males normally generate, they are absorbed. And by the time these animals go into the food supply chain, there are no increased levels of these hormones left in those food products that we consume. Just to give you an idea, if you were to eat a beefsteak, then you would have about 9 nanograms of hormone in it. If you were to take a birth control pill, one a day, you would consume 30,000 nanograms. So if you look at the things that we do, that we eat, there are many, many plant-based products that contain way higher hormone levels than anything beef you will ever put in your mouth. And the same is certainly true for medications such as birth control, contraceptive pills that people consume. So in my opinion, this is a discussion that has one reason and one reason only, and that is to deter people from eating animal-based foods. But it's not based in facts and in reality.
Absolutely. And a lot of those soy products that people eat have a lot more estrogen, right?
That's correct. Yeah. That's correct. It's all in the public domain. These are things that are not a secret, but people just simply choose to ignore them.
Yeah, it's a big problem. Let's kind of move on here. So we're pretty efficient, though. People cite numbers that make animal agriculture look bad. They're including the rest of the world in these numbers, which has a really poor efficiency.
Yes, this is a mistake that's made not by accident, but intentionally. We by far have the lowest environmental footprint of any livestock producing country in the world. Whether you look at our cattle, beef or dairy, whether you look at our pigs or whether you look at our poultry, for all of these livestock commodities, we have the lowest environmental footprint, amounting to a total of 3.9% of greenhouse gases for all livestock commodities combined. In other countries, that's a different story. So, for example, while we produce about 23,000 pounds of milk per dairy cow per year, India produces about 1,000 pounds of milk per cow per year, and that means that you need about 20 to 23 times the number of cows there to produce as much milk as one cow here. In Mexico, they need 4 to 5 times the number of animals to produce the same amount of product as we do with one animal here. And so that cumulatively has a much different environmental footprint. So what I'm talking about here right now is called efficiencies. And efficiencies in livestock, efficiencies in food production are not easily understood by the consumer. But what the consumer does understand is, for example, fuel efficiencies of cars and resulting emissions. So, for example, let's say I were to talk to your mom or your dad, and let's say they had been driving a car for 30, 40 years. Then they would certainly understand that their first car, the first car they ever drove, which had much worse fuel efficiency than the car they currently drive, had a much higher environmental footprint. Because if their old car had needed twice as much gasoline to get 100 miles than the car today, then the higher demand for fuel resulted in much more emissions. Fuel efficiencies and emissions in vehicles are clearly understood by consumers. But the consumer does not understand that the same holds true for livestock. If you can produce a given amount of product with much fewer animals, then this is a win-win. For example, in the United States, we used to have 25 million dairy cows back in 1950, 25 million. Today we have no longer 25, we now have 9 million dairy cows, but we are producing 60% more milk with this much smaller herd. Yeah. And that has shrunk the carbon footprint of a modern herd by 2/3 compared to the old one. This is the same as a Toyota Prius or a Tesla compared to a 1950 Chevy. So we have drastically improved vehicle efficiencies leading to much lower emissions. And we've done the same thing in livestock production, and people don't understand that, yet they should.
Yeah. And what are the worldwide numbers? I think you also pointed out that worldwide, the greenhouse gas footprint of plants is actually more than animals.
So that can be easily misunderstood. Okay. So because it is true, what you said is true, but some of those plants are fed to animals.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So if you think of all greenhouse gases in the world from all sources, they amount to 49 gigatons. That's a big number. Okay. That's all the greenhouse gases from human activities in the world combined, 49. Of that total number of all greenhouse gases in the world, the US is responsible for 12% of the total. And that's through all the things we do in the country, driving and heating and cooling and eating and everything. So 12% of all greenhouse gases in the world from all sources stem from the United States. And 11 of the 12% that the US contributes stems from US fossil fuel using sources, such as transportation, power production and use, or cement industry. And 1% of the total, 1% of all greenhouse gases in the world stem from what we eat in the United States. Half of 1% of total greenhouse gases in the world stems from our animal-based food and the other half from our plant-based food. So we contribute as the United States to 1% of the total carbon footprint of all sources with the food supply chain we have here in this country. Just to give you an idea of how significant or insignificant what we eat is compared to all the other sources in the world combined. If you were interested in what the main environmental footprint is of our food supply chain from cradle to grave, then it might surprise you that it's not beef production, it's not animal production in general, it is actually the amount of food that we waste.
Yeah.
Because in the United States and globally, we're wasting 40% of all food, 40. 40% of all food produced is going to landfills, and that is not acceptable. And I'm actually very happy that our president just gave out an executive order last week to all of his agencies, to all of his lead agencies, to get us to a point where we curb food losses and food waste, because it's unacceptable that we waste 40%. By the way, of which there are quite great differences across different food categories. For example, the most wasted food in the United States by far is fruits and vegetables. At least 50% of fruits and vegetables go to waste. Animal-based diets are wasted at around 20%, still unacceptably high, but better than fruits and vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
We have to get to a point where we improve our entire food supply chain that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually looked those up in some studies because I wanted to point that in the film that most of it is the waste is these fruits and vegetable products. So we should probably get into all the actual gases talk, because that's really important. And you know a lot about the difference in methane and CO2. And it's a huge story, right? Because CO2 is a stock gas, right? And methane is a short-lived one. And there's all these different cycles going on, and they're just very different. You can't just look at numbers, right? So let's get into that.
Okay, but I have to warn you because that gets complicated. So let's just think of three greenhouse gases here, the three that discussed the most. CO2 is carbon dioxide, then there's methane, and there's nitrous oxide. And CO2 is mostly associated with the use of fossil fuels. Let's talk about that first. So what are fossil fuels? Fossil fuels are oil, coal, and gas. And originally, fossil fuels were decayed plant material that was stored in the ground for hundreds of millions of years. And the energy that is contained in those fossil fuels originated really from sunlight. If you think about it, fossil fuels are nothing else but decayed plant material, which during its lifetime absorbed sunlight. Okay, then those plants died, they decayed, they fossilized, and then they were in the ground for a long, long time. Until humans decided, hey, extracting those and burning those means that we can unleash the energy contained therein. So this oil, coal, and gas has been extracted, particularly over the last 60, 70 years, at large rates. Okay, we have taken a lot of that fossil fuel out of the ground. And what we are taking out of the ground is basically nothing other than pure carbon. Okay, so for example, if you take a pound of coal, let's say you go barbecue, okay, you take a pound of coal and you burn it. What's left over after you've burned it?
Well, it goes up into the atmosphere, and then there's a little bit of dust at the end.
Exactly. There's a little bit of ash left over, right? And the rest is carbon that goes into the atmosphere. So, and of course, you get some heat in the process that you can use to barbecue and so on. But when you burn fossil fuels, you have as a leftover some ash, some solids, but the vast majority is gone. And where is it? It is in the atmosphere. Every time you burn fossil fuel, you're converting something that was in the ground for a long time into the atmosphere. And now when that carbon is in the atmosphere, every time the sun, solar beams hit those molecules, these molecules heat up and trap the heat. This is the main source of human-caused greenhouse gases. This is the main part of human contributions to climate change, the use of fossil fuels. And this is basically a one-way street. The carbon that we are talking about was in the ground. We are taking it out of the ground. We are burning it. Now it's in the air, period. And what's important to note here is that carbon, that CO2 that's produced when you burn fossil fuel, that CO2 stays in the atmosphere for around 1,000 years. There's no atmospheric process that really destroys that CO2. Every time, Brian, every time you drive a car, and every time there's exhaust coming out of your tailpipe, you're adding new carbon to the atmosphere. There's only one way for CO2 to go, and that's up, 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 up. Okay? Now we talk about methane. Let's talk about methane from ruminant animals, because that's what everybody talks about. Everybody is so enamored with belching animals, belching cows and steers and so on, and also with their manure. So let's talk about that. So where does that carbon that's contained in the methane from belching animals, where does that come from? That originated, let's go to square one. It originated in CO2 and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That CO2 was taken on by plants, by grasses and legumes and so on. That CO2 was taken on by these plants along with sunlight during the process called photosynthesis. So during photosynthesis, plants take on CO2 from the air, and they take on solar radiation, and then they produce cellulose, and they produce oxygen. They give off the oxygen, as you know. So that carbon that was in the air as CO2 is going into the plant. It's used to build cellulose. And now the ruminant animals eat that plant, and some of that carbon that was in the plant is now either exhaled, just like you and I are exhaling CO2 right now. They of course also exhale CO2, or it's converted in the rumen of these animals in this very large stomach into methane. The reason why it's converted into methane is because there are microbes in the rumen. They take the cellulose and they are able to digest it. And as a off product, these microbes produce methane. That methane builds up in the rumen, and sooner or later it's burped out. It's coming out of its front. And what happens to that methane is it's now in the air, and it stays there in the air, but not for 1,000 years like CO2, but it stays in the air for 10 years, because methane is very different from CO2 by not having a lifespan of 1,000 years, but a lifespan of 10 years. And this is really important, because after 10 years, that's methane, CH4, is broken down by a process in the atmosphere that's called hydroxy oxidation. There are radicals in the air, and these radicals steal a hydrogen from the methane, from the CH4, and by doing that, it converts the CH4 into CO2, into carbon dioxide. And again, that's a process taking 10 years. And then that resulting CO2 is going back into plants, and then back into animals, and back into the air, and back into plants, back into animals, back into the air. If you don't increase livestock herds, if you have constant livestock herds, let's say if you have a beef operation with 100 cattle, or if you have a dairy farm with 100 cows, and you're not adding new cows, not adding new cattle, then the amount of methane that results from you working that farm will not add up over time, because the amount that you put into the atmosphere today is equal to the amount that's destroyed, because that gas has a lifespan of only 10 years. As long as we don't increase livestock herds, we don't add additional methane to the atmosphere, and that means that we are not adding additional warming to our atmosphere. So what you stated in your initial question is very true, and that is that fossil fuel-derived gases, particularly the CO2, is a so-called stock gas. You add new CO2 to the atmosphere, and it doesn't go away, it just adds up, it's additive. Whereas methane is a flow gas, and that's very different. It is not just produced, but it's also consumed and destroyed. And this is a part of the discussion that you will always hear the critics of animal agriculture either be ignorant of, or you hear them ignoring it. But that's not fair, because it's not just produced, it's also destroyed.
This is the most important thing. And I mean, I didn't know about it until I started researching this. And you're right, most people don't know about this at all. If you talk about anyone walking down the street, they would have no idea, because we've heard the opposite. And also, we've heard that methane is a stronger impact. Why do they have a stronger or a bigger value for the GHG, the impact?
So are you referring to the differences in potency across the greenhouse gases?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, because I'm curious why methane is more.
Okay. So it is true that methane, when you compare the greenhouse gases to one another, everything is converted into what's called CO2 equivalents. So what does that mean? It means that in a simplified way, CO2 has a global warming potential, GWP, of 1. Global warming potential characterizes the ability of a gas like CO2, methane, or nitrous oxide to store the heat from the sun. CO2 has a global warming potential of 1. Methane has a global warming potential of 28. That means one molecule of methane can store the heat from the sun 28 times better than one molecule of CO2. And nitrous oxide is the bad boy, because it has a global warming potential almost 300 times that of CO2. So it is true that methane is 28 times worse and nitrous oxide almost 300 times worse than CO2. But in this discussion, not only the global warming potential matters, but the lifespan of these gases matters at least to the same extent, if not to a greater extent. I would argue to a greater extent, because while this gas is potent, it is not just generated, it's also destroyed. Whereas CO2 is only built and not destroyed. Imagine the following. Imagine us taking a large bucket of water, and imagine you have a little spigot at the bottom of the bucket. So now the bucket is almost filled, but not quite. It's almost filled with water. So now you open the spigot and you let 1 gallon of water come out. At the same time that you open the spigot to let the water out, you're also refilling the bucket on top with another gallon of water. So you're letting some out at the bottom, but you're also putting a gallon in on top. And then after the refill on top is completed, you also close the spigot. Overall, you have not really increased the fill of that bucket, because you let go of a gallon and you put in a new gallon.
Mm-hmm.
That's what happens when you look at methane. You're adding new methane with your cows, but you're also destroying methane at the same rate. Okay, now let's use another analogy, and now let's look at what happens to a bucket when we simulate what the process is with CO2. So in the case of CO2, if you have a bucket filled with water and you put a gallon in there, then you now have the bucket with the original water plus 1 gallon.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no spigot there, okay? There is no spigot there. You're just adding new. And every time you add new fill to your bucket. There is no spigot, okay? So in the case of CO2, you have a stock gas. you're only adding, you're only increasing. And in the case of methane, you have a spigot, okay? You are not just adding, you are also subtracting. And that's what a normal budget looks like, where you have an income and expenses. In the case of methane, you have that. In the case of CO2, you do not.
So it's insane to only look at one side of the ledger.
Right. And it is fair to do when you have CO2 or nitrous oxide because they have a very long lifespan, and therefore it's fair to do it for them. But it's not fair to do it for methane because methane is a totally different gas.
Okay, so we're running out of time, but I really wanted to talk about the Eat Lancet paper because they came out with this planetary diet and they want everyone to eat, they want everyone to eat a thimble full of meat per week. So I think you have some criticism on that.
Yes, that is an understatement. I'm very critical of it. And there are several reasons why I'm very critical of it. First of all, what is it? It is a so-called planetary diet proposed by a group of scientists who feels that we should divorce ourselves from animal-based diets and move into plant-based diets, not just in the United States, but globally. They are allowing, for example, the consumption of 7 grams of beef, 7 grams of pork per day. They're also allowing you to eat 1.5 eggs, but not per day, per week. And I feel that this is a quasi-vegan diet that's not in agreement with the vast majority of people's interests in food. They claim that the reason why we should make that change is twofold. The one is that this change in diet would greatly protect human health. So they say it's better nutrition, resulting in better health outcome.
Yeah, right.
And secondly, they say that it would have a drastic impact on planetary health, meaning it would be better for the environment. When I read their report, first of all, I am not schooled in evaluating the health claims that they make, but I know many experts who are very well versed, and these experts say that the approach that's used, which is called nutritional epidemiology, is a very weak tool to predict chronic disease. Let me explain that really quickly. The way they do a study is by asking you, hey, Brian, what did you eat last year? Okay.
I don't know.
and then Brian has to really think very hard as to what he ate last year. And then they also ask you, hey, Brian, do you have colon cancer? Do you have diabetes? Have you ever had a heart attack? Are you obese? What do you weigh? And so on. Mm-hmm. And then they put one and one together. Okay. So you have eaten self-reported 50 eggs, and you have eaten so and so many pounds of beef and of fruit and of vegetable and so on. And then they calculate associations between what you ate and what diseases you have had. And then they say there are associations of X versus Y, and therefore we should eat or not eat certain foods. The problem why this is a weak tool is because there are so many confounding aspects. For example, people who eat a lot of meat oftentimes have a less healthy lifestyle because they also do other things like drink beer or move less and so on. Other confounders, for example, they claim that there's a certain health outcome eating red meat, and then they claim that there's another health outcome eating processed meat. The problem is people who eat the one always eat the other. I have never seen a person who eats processed meats but no red meat. Okay, so how do you isolate the one from the other? You can't. Okay, this is on the nutritional side, okay? Many nutritional experts feel that the tools used in Eat Lancet are blunt tools, are weak tools, tools that do not prove any causation. Causation of you get a disease if you eat X, Y, and Z before.
Exactly. I've had some.
So it's correlation but not causation. And the other thing, and that's where I am an expert, is the environmental avenue. Here, they've had several figures and tables in their report, and when I looked through them, I was shocked. I was just shocked because at any launch events up until this point, they had made a big claim that a change from the current diet around the world to their Eat Lancet diet would have drastic impacts on planetary health. And I looked at the report and I found that when they compared their Eat Lancet diet versus the standard American diet versus flexitarian diet, a vegetarian diet, a vegan diet, and so on, when they compared the different diets to one another for environmental parameters such as land use and water use and biodiversity loss and nitrogen and phosphorus and so on, when I looked at all these different variables, I found no differences. I found that there were no differences across diets in their own data, okay? In their own data. The only category where I saw differences was on greenhouse gases, and I also saw differences in biodiversity loss. Starting with the biodiversity loss, the worst biodiversity loss did not occur in the animal-based diets, but the worst biodiversity loss occurred in the plant-based diets, with the worst one being the vegan diet. And the reason is that vegan diet largely stems from monocropping agriculture and so on that has a pretty major impact on biodiversity loss through use of chemicals and so on. So there was actually a negative on biodiversity loss to the diets that they proposed. And in the category of greenhouse gases, their Eat Lancet diet was actually twice as good as a normal standard diet. But when you look at how they calculated greenhouse gases, then in their text, in their materials and methods, they stated that they used one type of global warming potential calculations. But then when you look at the results section and when you talk to the people who did the calculation, you find that they used a very different one. Mm-hmm. So I confronted the authors of Eat Lancet and with my criticism, and then received an email at some point by the science director of Eat Lancet telling me that I should not worry about the environmental part of it because Eat Lancet is really based on nutritional considerations only. It is not the diet to save the planet. It's not the diet to save the climate. It is solely a diet to protect human health. And in my opinion, this was a total 180. And in my opinion, this was a retraction. I cannot understand why they don't see that as a retraction, because all the claims I've heard up until this point were to the point of eat our diet, protect your health, and save the planet. Mm-hmm. And so this retraction that I saw, that I see as being a retraction, was profound, but it's not shared that way by the authors. They still feel that they have a claim. I don't see that at all. And May 2nd, we will have a discussion at Cornell University to see whether we can get to common grounds.
Oh, that's good. This should be public because it sounds like it was just a private email, but we need this to be publicly known.
Yeah, it's not just the email, which I, by the way, made public on Twitter, but it is a discussion that has to be publicly held because these claims were facilitated through the world's media, and the vast majority of people are not experts, and they hear these kind of claims and are shocked. And I think we have to be fair about giving people fact-based information to make science-based decisions. And that's not just true for Joe Blow, but it's true for all those public policy sectors that have an interest in determining whether we should have plant-based diets in schools or Meatless Monday events in communities and so on. People want to know, and they have the right to have fact-based information.
Absolutely. What was their greenhouse gas figures that they use? What is the potential they use for methane, by the way? I think you found that it was completely ridiculous.
Well, they say in one part of their report that they used the global warming potential for 20 years, when indeed they used the global warming potential for 100 years. I know that from the models who actually did the work in modeling their numbers. So in my opinion, their predictions are flawed. And in my opinion, one of the most important considerations around the animal-based greenhouse gases has not been considered, and that is what we had just discussed, namely the fact that methane is totally different from CO2. Mm-hmm. And if you don't consider that in your calculations, that an equal amount of methane that is produced by what you produce, livestock-wise, is also being destroyed, if you don't take that into consideration, then you are putting out very misleading numbers. You know, the reason why that matters to me so much is because I have a real desire in reducing our carbon footprint as a society. I want to arrive at those solutions that get us there. And in my opinion, reports like Eat Lancet set us on a totally wrong path into getting us to that point. Okay. People are led to believe that what they eat is the greatest aspect of their individual carbon footprint. And that is simply not the case. And so I want people to make a difference through the way they live their lives, and eating Eat Lancet will definitely not get them there. I will give you one example. If you were an omnivore today and you were to decide to become a vegan from now on for the next year, then you would reduce your carbon footprint by 0.8 tons of CO2 equivalents.
Mm-hmm.
So just remember the number 0.8 tons. That's a change from an omnivore diet to a vegan diet per year, 0.8 tons. If you decide to fly from New York to Frankfurt, one transatlantic flight equates to 1.6 tons. So twice as much as becoming a vegan for a 1 year period. Okay, so that's not nothing, it's something, but I think we would agree it's not at all what is being promised to us by this self-proclaimed movement of veganism. So does it have a lower impact? It does, but it certainly does not have the type of impact that they claim it does.
And the people who are putting this forward, these big rich people, are doing private jet flights all over the place.
Well, this is quite unsettling. When you see who funded Eat Lancet, you find that one of the two main funding bodies is the Wellcome Foundation. Behind that are, well, I won't even go into that, but it's kind of a religious movement that's anti-meat.
Yeah.
But the other one is the Stordalen Foundation, and that is led by a lady by the name of Gunhild Stordalen, a billionaire's wife who, together with her husband, owns a large jet and flies with her friends to exotic locations to party, and telling us, the rest of the world, how to live our lives to be more carbon neutral. I find that unacceptable. It's just mind-boggling.
It's absurd. I made a whole YouTube video about this that features her, and I'll link to it in the show notes. Laughing guy and his food lies. I'll share it with you. It's amazing, but it's ridiculous. So we can pause for a second because I kind of edit this. I want to ask you if you have a few more minutes to finish these points, or if possibly we could pick this up another time, because I would just love to do like 10 more minutes or something on like
okay, let's do 10 more
lab-grown
minutes.
meat. Yeah. We can just get all the way all at once, because there's love it to get this all done at once. So, but you also, the drilling, the methane from drilling. Do you want to talk about that? The other sources of methane?
Sure, I can.
Okay, yeah. So there's other sources of methane that we should be worried about, right? Or you've seen some other things going on?
Well, actually, over the last few decades, well, no, I should say since 2006, we see a global upkick in methane. And the question has been, where does that methane come from? Anti-animal agriculturalists have said, well, it must be the cows, clearly. But scientists have really looked into what the different sources could be. And livestock was one potential source. Another one was fracking, the extraction of so-called shale gas and oil. What has been identified as the source is basically starting in 2006, the United States has really increased the amount of fracking. That's really when it started at a large rate. So what that basically means is you take a huge straw into the crust, and then until you reach those bubbles there in the ground that contain the fossil fuels. And when you reach that, vast amounts of biogas containing methane escape. And every time you look at, let's say, the United States from space, using satellites with methane filters, you see that methane is coming particularly from those areas where we frack, where we do fracking at large amounts. And so today, the emission inventories really look at shale gas and oil extraction as the main source of methane. And that, in contrast to the methane from cattle, that actually is also a one-way street type of thing, because it comes from down there, it goes into the air, and it's not cycled back and forth like the methane from livestock.
And our herds have gone down. If it was just cows, then why is this climate change stuff constantly getting worse when our herd size is going down?
Well, listen to this, Brian. 150 years ago, pre-settlement in the United States, we had a few thousands of Indians, maybe a few hundred thousands of Indians, but certainly not millions of people. But we did have millions of wild ruminants, particularly bisons. And so the estimates are that we had between 60 and 100 million bisons roaming the Great Plains of the US. Between 60 and 100 million bisons. Today we have 90 million beef cattle. Those bisons and cattle are pretty much the same. When you look at how much methane comes off a bison versus a bovine today, you will find that they emit pretty much the same. So maybe it's 10-20% plus or minus, but we're not talking about a great new addition of methane sources through the addition of cattle. I mean, as you know, most of the bisons are gone, but we replaced them with cattle, with bovines. But overall, the total amount of methane coming from either enteric emissions, meaning belching, or manure for hundreds of years hasn't changed in the United States because we replaced natural herds of bisons with domesticated herds of livestock. Overall, the total amount of enteric and manure-derived methane might have changed 10-20%, but not more than that, for hundreds of years. What has changed is that we now have 270 million cars in this country and many fossil fuel using sources that put carbon emissions into the atmosphere at very high rates.
Yeah. You had a colleague from Cornell that had some science about this as well.
Yeah, there's a gentleman at Cornell. His name is Robert Howard, and he has some YouTubes and so on out there that you might find, looking at explanations as to where that new methane is coming from. And he concluded that the methane that has been added since 2006 is coming from fossil fuel extraction and use, meaning shell oil extraction and the use of those fossil fuels.
Yeah, with like fingerprinting methods and stuff like that. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, but this gets really complicated really soon, so that's why I spare you with that. But you can actually fingerprint where methane comes from.
And then, last thing on that Eat Lancet paper, I mean, didn't you find a whole bunch of misrepresented references and it was just like this sloppy piece of work?
Well, I found about 12 of them and I let the authors know. And I know that the journal went back and changed the online version of the Eat Lancet paper because there were so many sections of the Eat Lancet paper where scientists like myself looked at how did they calculate things. And of course, when you look at that, then most journal articles give you a citation, a reference to allow you to go back as to what the methodology was. And there were countless pieces of Eat Lancet where you got to a point where you wanted to know how did they calculate it, and then a reference was cited that had nothing to do with the subject matter area that you were interested in. I have hardly ever seen a piece of scientific publication that was done more sloppy than Eat Lancet. That is something that is very much to the discredit of such a important journal as the Lancet and the authors of Eat Lancet, because when you put something out that you intend to be used to inform public policy globally, then you have to put your very best foot forward. And that has certainly not been the case. I was very disappointed that people who claim to be world-class scientists have put a very sloppy piece of work forward.
Yeah, it's really sad. It's obvious that they have an agenda. And I'm getting into all this stuff with different people I've interviewed. It's just how this anti-meat agenda is just so weird. And they've just hijacked the conversation and they just have this mission to do any measures to prove it, even though it's not true. And it's really troubling.
Yeah, I agree.
So that kind of leads into the next thing is they're trying to do this lab-grown meat. You know, this is kind of like the last piece of the puzzle we can talk about is they have these ideas that this is how we're going to save the world. We're going to use this insanely complicated process that's trying to mimic nature and might even be not even possible to somehow do better than nature can do on its own.
Well, don't underestimate human ingenuity, okay? So I would never say it's not possible.
Okay, yeah.
They're making great progress in artificially producing meat-like substances. Let me just explain to you what this is, okay? The so-called cell-grown meat alternatives, they call themselves clean meat, are produced in the following way. So first of all, imagine a setup that really looks like a factory, okay? This has nothing to do with farming now. This is a real factory-type setting, a lab-type setting. People who work there, they have to wear full-body kind of suits and masks and so on in order not to contaminate anything. certainly not the image you would get of a farmer on a farm or a rancher or so.
Nothing natural. Yeah.
No. So these people under these conditions, first of all, they need to have certain cells, and these are called stem cells. And the cells they get from cattle. So they go to a packing plant and they open up a deceased cow, a pregnant cow, to be precise. They cut out the fetus of that pregnant cow, and they take from this fetus the so-called fetal bovine serum, which contains the stem cells. They then go to the lab and they take the stem cells, put them into petri dishes, and subject them to all the nutrients that a cell needs. So basically all the stuff that you eat, essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, vitamins, micro and minerals, all that stuff needs to be fed to those cells, and they then grow and differentiate themselves into muscle cells, become bigger and bigger and bigger. One piece of the puzzle that I have not been able to get good answers to is, how do they keep those cells free from pathogens? Because you can imagine if you have stem cells growing muscle cells and you now have that medium growing bigger and bigger and bigger, the thought of a salmonella or E. coli or other pathogens getting in there and contaminating this thing would mean the whole work would be for nothing. So I have talked to stem cell biologists here at the University of California in Davis. They have told me that when they do this kind of work, they have to put these stem cells into an ocean of antibiotics to keep them safe and to keep them protected from pathogens. Now, when I talk to the cell-based meat alternative guys, they tell me, no, we don't use antibiotics. So now I have scientists here telling me you must use them. And then you have the people selling that stuff in the future telling me, no, we don't do that. So unless I hear a compelling explanation as to how they keep their cell-based meat alternatives clean, so to say, and free of pathogens, I have my doubts. So to me, this type of operation has a considerable ick factor associated with it, namely the extraction of the fetal bovine serum cells from those dead animals. Then the next step, this artificial step in the lab, is something that I consider repulsive. Okay, I would never put that in my mouth, and I would certainly not feed it to my family. It's a different thing compared to plant-based alternatives to meat. So the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Meats and so on, that's a different process. What we just talked about are the so-called cell-based alternatives to meat. And to me, they will not, in my opinion, they will not be acceptable to a large segment of the population.
Well, even if they are acceptable, somehow we accept it. How much energy and input does it take to make? And doesn't it seem like it would just equal what we could do with a cow? I mean, just refrigeration alone and the sterilization and all these antibiotics, let alone, like you said, people are so scared of antibiotics in meat. What about antibiotics just trying to grow your cell cultured meat? But just how much energy would it take? I mean, I'm imagining refrigeration requires a ton of energy, right? If you're going to have these like Costco-sized warehouses refrigerated, trying to make enough meat to feed the world, that's millions of dollars worth of electricity and greenhouse gases.
Well, I recently saw a peer-reviewed publication that looked at energy inputs, and the energy inputs were actually very significant. Routinely is done by people who sell these things or who are interested in selling those things, is that they only compare the actual meat of a beef animal to the meat alternative of a plant-based burger or the cell-based alternative we just talked about. But beef, for example, is a whole lot more than just producing meat. Okay, there are 400 different products in a beef animal, and I just name a few. Leather, for example. Okay, leather for human clothing and shoes and so on. Then heart valves and so on. You can make all different kinds of medical devices and so on from the beef body, basically. So if you were to forego the use of beef animals, you would have to replace 400 different other products with some kind of petroleum or plastic or so alternative. And when you look at all of that, you have to do what's called a consequential life cycle assessment. That has never been done before. It will be done by me soon.
Yes.
And I think it's very important because we need to look at all the intended and unintended consequences of producing food. And we need to find ways of doing this in the most natural way in the way that's least environmentally harmful, in the way that's most ethically responsible, in the way that also takes into consideration there are whole communities that are involved in growing this kind of food. There are millions of people. In the world, there are billions of people involved in animal agriculture. For example, the dairy sector alone in the world employs 1 billion people.
Whoa.
1 billion people. Think about that. That's the dairy sector alone. So we have these city cowboys here who say, well, let's just get rid of, meat and milk and eggs and everything will be better. You should really inform yourself first, because what you're suggesting there is a drastic move into a direction that might have a lot of unintended consequences that you might not even oversee at this point.
People rely on animals for their living, especially in third world countries. The animals is all they have. The animals are all they have, and they rely on them to live for beyond just food. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So we got to talk about Impossible Burgers for a second too. Just how much weird stuff goes into them and how many weird proteins, and it barely got passed by the FDA.
So the maker of the Impossible Burger is a genius, okay? A very smart person and former professor at Stanford, triple member on the National Academies, a very interesting, very intelligent person. I've met him in person.
Mm-hmm.
He claims that the reason why people like a beef burger is because of the taste of blood. That's what he says. Mm-hmm. I doubt that, but that's what he said. That's his storyline. And he decided that for his plant-based burger, he needed to come up with something that produces that taste of blood and that looks like blood. So he deployed a process, a genetically modified process, GMO process, in producing his artificial blood. It's called leg hemoglobin. The leg hemoglobin is the portion of his burger that's the GMO portion. And when he submitted his burger for approval by the Food and Drug Administration, they were okay with the other ingredients, but they were balking at the leg hemoglobin. In fact, you will find a FDA report published on the internet if you Google Impossible Burger and FDA, you'll find it, where they described their process of analyzing the Impossible Burger. And in that report, they state, and I quote, that in the leg hemoglobin, they found 40 unexpected and 6 never before identified proteins. And that made me wonder why the FDA allows the purchase of the Impossible Burger in 5,000 restaurants. At the same time, they don't allow the purchase of the Impossible Burger in retail. And they do allow that for Beyond Meats. Beyond Meats you can buy all throughout the United States and in other countries too in the supermarkets, but you cannot buy the Impossible Burger patty in supermarkets. And last month I read that the reason for that, and the reason is that the FDA has not approved the leg hemoglobin as safe enough to be sold in supermarkets. What I will never understand is how it's possible that a product that's not deemed safe to be sold in supermarkets is deemed to be safe to be sold in restaurants. You explain that to me.
That's insane. Wow. Yeah, I didn't know about
So I don't know the details. I did ask them that on Twitter. They got me a response that was very, very much unsatisfactory. I think they will get eventually FDA approval. But to me, it is disconcerting that there are processes in and around the approval of food items in this country that are not transparent, that are not clear. And personally, I have eaten one of those things. I don't think they taste like beef. I don't think they taste bad. And if I were a vegan or vegetarian with a craving for meat, but I have ethical problems eating it, they might be okay. For somebody like you and I don't think it would be okay. But it's a personal decision.
Yeah, I've never tried them. I probably just don't even want to. But so to go out, sometimes I get really down about all this and think that vegans are going to take over the world. But I think it's not the case. I think there's less vegans out there than we really think, right?
There are in the United States about 2% vegans. What I find interesting is that 84% of all vegans, according to the statistics I read recently, 84% of all vegans stay vegan for 1 year.
That's it.
It is something that many 20-year-olds go through when they're in college. There's peer pressure and so on. They become vegan for a year, and then after a while they stop it. Now, vegetarian is a different story, obviously, right? Because they can still eat dairy and eggs and so on. But being a vegan really means that you have made a commitment, one that is not easy to honor, because everywhere you go, you find products that contain animal-based foods. And even in things like wine, you have animal-based foods. I mean, it's everywhere, okay? So be a true vegan is very hard.
Well, what about all the products out there? Most products are actually beef. I think, don't you have just a few figures on this that I heard you talking about that made me feel a little bit better, that actually the vast majority of, say, food products, there's very few fake meat products. Oh,
yeah. So the total consumption of beef is about 222 pounds. The total consumption of beef-like products, I mean fake beef products, is 0.35. So it's 222 pounds versus 0.35. So when these guys who produce these fake beef products say, we have generated a movement here and we are growing 20%, that's not a lie. But if you're nothing and you grow by 20%, then you're still next to nothing, okay? 0.35 is minuscule compared to 222. I think everybody can agree by just looking at those numbers.
All right. Yeah. It seems, sometimes it just seems like the voices that are the loudest are the few people, that really are trying to push this agenda, but it's actually not that bad. All right. Well, this has been enlightening. I hope people share this with their friends and family who don't understand this, because it's just so different from what people have heard through the mainstream media. So yeah, thank you, Dr. Mitloehner. And can we find you somewhere, or did you want to say any parting words?
Well, I think that this is a very important discussion, and let's not fool ourselves. Probably one of the most important decisions we make day to day is what we eat. And I think it's very important that we have a honest and fact-based discussion around food, and that includes animal-based foods. I think animal-based foods are very important to the vast majority of people in this country and worldwide. And we should continue to strive to make that food as responsible in its production as possible, that we honor the environment, that we value the animals for what they give us. And I understand that this might sound ironic to some, because eventually we kill those animals, but we are responsible of providing them with the best possible quality of life throughout their lifetime, and then ensure that at the time that we take that life, we keep honoring it by being ethical, by being efficient around that last step. I think that people can really be assured that the meat that we consume in this country is produced by people who have the best in mind with respect to raising it ethically, valuing the environment in which it's raised, and producing a safe product. I think that's out of question. That is also, and that's very important, that's also affordable, okay? So let's take some of that quasi-religious discussion out of our food fights and stop food fights and enjoy and honor the choices we have and we can make, and look at food as what it is. It's the basics of life, and it is something that we should enjoy and not just ruminate over and have food fights about.
I love it. Yeah, thank you for all your research you're doing, and let's spread the message and continue getting this word out there. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Brian.
Okay.
Thank you. Take good care.
Bam. Take that, soy boys. You got no arguments left. Please check out all the great grass-fed meats raised in Texas and shipped to your door at nosetotale.org. This is some really premium beef at a surprisingly low price. Chip in a few bucks at patreon.com/Peak Human and pre-order the Food Lies film at Indiegogo.com. I'm also posting daily on social media, so just search for Food Lies on any platform. Join the conversation. It's pretty fun and educational, and sometimes we even get angry vegans spicing things up in the comment sections. Oh, what fun. See you next week, buds.